Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're venturing into something pretty remarkable and, honestly, quite startling.
Yeah.
A condition called Klazomania.
Klazomania.
Now, I'm guessing that's not a word you hear every day.
No, definitely not.
And that's kind of what makes it so interesting, right?
It really is. It's a rare phenomenon, absolutely. But the way it's been documented, some of those details, they give us this fascinating look into, well, how the brain can express itself in really unexpected ways.
Absolutely. So our goal today is basically to unpack what Klazomania actually is.
Mm-hmm.
We want to explore, the potential neurological drivers behind it
Yeah.
and figure out where it fits compared to other conditions that involve unusual vocalizations.
Mm.
We've gone through a fair few medical journals, some really detailed case reports, too, to pull out the key stuff for you.
And it's important to say the sources are limited because it is so rare. But what we do have is quite rich, historically speaking.
Right. So prepare yourselves because this deep dive, I think, is going to uncover some genuinely surprising things about our nervous system.
Definitely.
Okay, let's jump right in then. What exactly is Klazomania?
Well, the name itself gives us a pretty big clue. It comes from Greek klazo.
Klazo.
Yeah, meaning to scream. A researcher named L. Benedek actually coined it back in 1925.
1925, wow.
Yeah, and fundamentally, Klazomania is defined by compulsive shouting.
Compulsive shouting. Okay, that sounds incredibly intense. What does that actually mean? What kind of shouting are we talking about?
It's varied according to the reports. It's not just, yelling.
Right.
We're talking swearing, sometimes grunting sounds, even things described as barking.
Barking.
Yeah. And interestingly, it's often seen alongside other behaviors that are, well, more Pultic-like, things you might have heard of, like echolalia.
Repeating what others say.
Exactly. And palea, repeating your own words, and sometimes even copulalia.
The involuntary swearing.
That's the one.
So it's this whole cluster, potentially, not just the shouting itself. That paints a more complex picture than just compulsive screaming. When did doctors first start noticing this?
Well, like I said, Benedict's first report in 1925, and that was in a patient who had developed something called post-encephalitic Parkinsonism,
Oh, okay.
which came after they'd had encephalitis lethargica.
Right, the sleeping sickness pandemic. That was huge in the early 20th century, wasn't it?
It was, and this link, this historical connection to that specific type of encephalitis, it's actually pretty crucial for understanding Klazomania, especially those early cases.
Okay, so what did Benedict observe back then?
His descriptions are surprisingly detailed. He talked about extremely loud shouting, not just words, but like individual syllables, vowel sounds, even animal noises, as we mentioned.
Animal noises.
Hmm.
But they weren't in pain. It sounds like they would be.
That's the strange part. He specifically noted there was no sign of actual physical pain or discomfort, despite how it sounded.
Huh.
He also observed that some people seemed to kind of feel it coming on. They could anticipate an episode.
Really?
Yeah, and sometimes apparently they could hold it off temporarily, suppress it by taking deep breaths, but it was exhausting for them.
I can imagine. Like holding back a massive sneeze or something, but much more intense.
Something like that, perhaps. And he also noted that feeling anxious could make the episodes happen more often, but it didn't really change how they presented, the actual shouting itself.
Okay, so anxiety increases frequency, but not the form. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Then, just a couple of years later, 1927, two colleagues of Benedict's, von Thurzo and Catona, they documented more cases.
Adding more detail.
Yeah, they added observations like the person having an angry, flushed face during an episode and being extremely restless and agitated.
So physical signs accompanying the vocalizations.
Exactly. And importantly, they also stressed that the person seemed to stay fully conscious and aware of everything happening around them.
That awareness piece feels really important. It probably helps separate it from things like, say, certain types of seizures.
Precisely. That retained consciousness is a key differentiator.
Now, you mentioned diffidics earlier, and the sources talk about similarities to Tourette syndrome. Can you unpack that connection a bit?
Sure. Klazomania definitely shares some features with vocal tics, which are, a hallmark of Tourette's.
Right.
But there's a distinction often made, sometimes called Touretteism. In the cases linked to encephalitis, the idea is that the tics or tic-like symptoms, including the Klazomania, are a result of the brain damage from the infection.
Ah, so it's secondary to something else, rather than primary Tourette syndrome.
Kind of, yes. The underlying cause is thought to be different, even if the symptoms look similar. It's not the same neurological basis as typical Tourette's.
Okay, so similar symptoms, potentially different origins, although didn't one source Bates, I think, suggests something different.
Yes, you're right. Bates and colleagues, in a 1996 case report, they actually proposed that Klazomania could just be a specific type of vocal tic.
Even if the person didn't have the motor tics you usually need for a Tourette's diagnosis.
Exactly. So they were suggesting it might fit within the broader spectrum of Tourettic disorders, even without the full Tourette's picture. It shows the classification isn't completely settled.
It really highlights how complex these neurological overlaps can be. Okay, let's dig into the symptoms more. We've got the shouting, the potential other tics, the flushed face. What else characterizes these episodes?
Well, the flushed look seems pretty consistent, and as Benedict noted, feeling agitated can definitely ramp up the frequency.
Right.
The episodes themselves can vary a lot in how long they last, but often there's this pattern described. It builds up, hits a peak intensity.
The really loud shouting part.
Yeah, presumably, and then it might lessen, maybe periods of quiet, remissions before it finally stops.
In all this time, despite sounding distressed, they're not actually feeling physical pain.
That's what the reports consistently say, a real disconnect between the sound and the sensation. It's quite striking.
It really is. Can it happen alongside other involuntary things?
Yes, sometimes it co-occurs with other involuntary movements. One example mentioned is oculogeric crises.
Oculogeric crises. What's that?
That's when the eyes involuntarily deviate, usually upwards, and get stuck there for a period.
Wow, okay. And you mentioned distinguishing it from epilepsy earlier.
Right. Temporal lobe epilepsy is sometimes compared, but Klazomania attacks are generally shorter, and crucially, consciousness isn't usually lost, unlike many seizures.
Got it. There was a really detailed case report mentioned from 1961, a postman, KR.
Ah, yes, Wolfart's report on KR. That one is incredibly illuminating.
Tell us about him.
So KR had that history of encephalitis lethargica as a child. Later, he also had a head injury. Years after that, he started developing oculogeric spasms, like we just mentioned, and also some involuntary movements in his mouth and tongue dyskinesias.
And then the Klazomania started.
Yes, his first episode hit when he was 44. It was described as about 30 minutes of shouting, but he was fully conscious the whole time.
30 minutes of shouting.
That's...
Conscious, that's hard to imagine.
It is. Afterwards, he apparently said he felt crazy for hours and was totally exhausted the next day. So a significant aftermath, too.
Wolfart's account of one KR's attacks was incredibly detailed, wasn't it? Walk us through that.
It really paints a picture. Just before an attack, KR would apparently become absent-minded, stare blankly, maybe just give one-word answers if spoken to.
Like a warning sign.
Almost, yeah. Then the attack itself would start with one of those oculogeric spasms, eyes rolling up, and then it would ramp up to the peak. Face bright red, big uncontrolled arm and leg movements, flailing, kicking, and then the vocalizations, loud swearing, shouting, screaming, grunting, barking, along with heavy panting.
It sounds like a complete storm, physically and vocally.
Absolutely. But here's the truly remarkable part. Amidst all that, he was still aware.
Still?
Yes, he'd make comments that were relevant to what was going on around him. He'd even try to apologize for his behavior while it was happening.
Apologize during the attack?
Apparently so.
Yeah.
And there were moments where if someone spoke sharply to him, he could briefly get a grip, stop for a second.
Right.
But then it would immediately return. The shouting, the movements.
So awareness, but very little control.
Precisely. And physically, other things were happening too. Lots of saliva, sweating, racing heart, tachycardia.
So autonomic signs as well. How long did these episodes last for him?
That intense peak phase, the really severe shouting and movement, lasted about 30 minutes. But the whole episode, from start to finish, could be around an hour and a half. Towards the end, the quiet periods between the shouting bursts would get longer and longer until it stopped.
An hour and a half.
Yeah.
Experiencing that while aware, that's almost incomprehensible. That awareness piece just keeps standing out.
It really does. It's central to understanding the subjective experience, I think.
Okay, let's pivot slightly. What about the underlying causes? What are the theories here?
Well, that strong link back to encephalitis lethargica is the starting point for a lot of the thinking.
Right, the brain infection.
Exactly. Yankovic and Mishia, in a 2006 review, basically classify that post-encephalitis Klazomania as a type of Tourettism, like we discussed Tics caused by that specific illness.
So the idea is some kind of brain damage or dysfunction left over from the encephalitis.
Pretty much. It suggests disruptions in the brain networks that control movement, vocalization, maybe even emotion. It really shows how interconnected those systems are.
Makes sense. Did researchers get more specific than just brain damage? Any particular areas or pathways suspected?
Yes, Wolfart, back in his 1961 work on KR, he had a hypothesis. He suggested maybe an irritating lesion, some problematic spot in the mesencephalon that's part of the midbrain.
Okay, midbrain. Involved in motor control.
Among other things, yes. And he specifically pointed to a malfunction in the mesostriatal pathway. Think of it as a key communication highway linking the substantia nigra to the globus pallidus in the striatum. Crucial for movement control, reward.
So a problem in that pathway could lead to overstimulation, like a short circuit.
That was his idea, yeah. He called it a mesencephalic fit, leading to this overstimulation during an attack.
Interesting. What about other ideas? Bates' group had a different angle, didn't they?
They did. In their 96 report, they talked about a possible link to the combined effects of brain damage from either long-term heavy alcohol use or encephalitis.
So maybe multiple potential triggers or combined factors?
It seems possible, yeah. Their case involved someone with those factors who also had vocal tics and occasional klazomania. It suggests maybe it's not always just one thing, but perhaps a vulnerability plus some kind of brain insult.
Okay. And did autopsies ever shed light on this from the encephalitis victims?
Yes. Yankovic and Mejia mentioned autopsy findings. They found specific types of damage, like neurofibrillary tangles and neuron loss, in several key brain areas.
Which areas?
Places like the globus pallidus, hypothalamus, midbrain tegmentum, the periaqueductal gray matter, the striatum, substantia nigra.
Well, that's quite a list. A lot of overlap with motor control and, wait, periaqueductal gray matter. You mentioned that earlier. What's its significance?
Right. Wolfart's team zeroed in on that too. It's also in the mesencephalon, the midbrain. They thought it could be a key origin point for klazomania.
Why is there specifically?
Because in animals, that area is known to be the main vocalizing center. And if you electrically stimulate it in animals,
You get sounds.
you can actually evoke sounds very similar to the grunting and animal noises sometimes reported in klazomania. So a really intriguing link to basic vocalization circuits.
That is fascinating. They also talked about the autonomic nervous system, right?
Yeah.
Via the hypothalamus.
Yes, they noted the physical signs we discussed, the pupil dilation, fast heart rate, sweating, salivation, blood pressure changes, even facial expressions like lip retraction.
Yeah.
They pointed out how similar those look to something called sham rage seen in animal experiments.
Sham rage.
Yeah, it's thought to involve the hypothalamus, and it produces this outburst of rage-like behaviors and autonomic responses. They saw parallels with the barking, grunting, and overall physical state in klazomania.
But wasn't there a counterargument about the hypothalamus?
There was. Bates and his colleagues, in that 96 paper again, they argued that the neuroimaging and pathology in their case didn't really show the kind of hypothalamic involvement you'd expect in sham rage.
Okay. So we have these autonomic symptoms, clearly, but whether the hypothalamus is the main driver, like in sham rage, seems debatable. Two different viewpoints in the literature.
Exactly. It's possible the mechanisms aren't identical in every case, or maybe the pathways are just more complex than initially thought. Our understanding is definitely still evolving.
So lots of compelling theories, often tied to that encephalitis history, but the exact how and why are still a bit murky. How do doctors actually diagnose this? And perhaps more importantly, can it be treated?
Well, diagnosis is mostly clinical. It relies on the patient's history, the symptoms observed. There aren't specific tests for klazomania itself.
Okay.
As we mentioned, Yankovic and Mejia consider it a form of Touretteism when it follows something like encephalitis. The key diagnostic step really is ruling out other things.
Like epilepsy.
Right, or other medical conditions that can cause halitics or involuntary vocalizations. Standard diagnostic manuals emphasize ruling those out before landing on something like Tourette syndrome itself.
And you mentioned EEG tests.
Yes, Bates reported in 96 that EEG recordings taken during klazomania episodes were normal, no seizure activity. That helps differentiate it.
Okay, so diagnosis by observation and exclusion, essentially. What about treatment? It sounds so distressing. Surely there's something.
Unfortunately, treatment options that work consistently are, well, lacking. Success has been very limited.
Really? Nothing works.
There's one report mentioning atropine sulfate helped a bit with some associated involuntary movements in one patient, but a combination of phenobarbital and trioxyphenidyl drugs, sometimes used for seizures or movement disorders that didn't work for klazomania.
And anti-epileptics, given the fit description.
Nope, anti-epileptic medications also haven't proven effective.
Wow.
It really highlights how much we still don't understand about the fundamental brain mechanisms causing it. If we don't know exactly what's broken, it's hard to know how to fix it.
That makes sense. It's quite sobering. Okay, finally, let's just touch on why this rare condition matters historically. What's its significance?
I think its main significance lies in how observing it, especially after encephalitis lethargica, helped solidify the idea that tics like those in Tourette's have a real neurological basis.
Ah, it provided evidence against purely psychological explanations.
Exactly. It showed that damage or dysfunction in specific brain circuits could directly lead to these kinds of involuntary behaviors. And then later, the potential link suggested in 96 to things like long-term alcohol abuse or carbon monoxide poisoning.
Right.
That broadened the scope, suggesting other kinds of neurological insults might also, perhaps in vulnerable people, trigger similar responses.
So even though it's rare, studying Klazomania has given us valuable clues about brain function.
Definitely. Clues about how different brain areas control complex things like speech, motor actions, and how disruptions can manifest in these really dramatic, unexpected ways.
So in a way, its rarity doesn't diminish its importance for understanding the bigger picture of brain-behavior relationships.
Sums it all. Precisely.
Well, this has been a truly fascinating and, yeah, somewhat unsettling deep dive into Klazomania. We've covered the core feature, compulsive, shouting its historical roots in encephalitis lethargica, how it relates to but differs from insaptic disorders like Tourette's, and the fact that its exact causes and effective treatments are still, well, largely unknown.
It really underscores the brain's complexity, doesn't it? And how much more there is to learn.
It absolutely does. The detailed accounts from those old case reports, even though there aren't many, they're incredibly valuable windows into this condition.
They really are. They continue to inform how we think about neurological disorders today.
And it leaves you as a pretty big question, I think. Considering the history, the potential brain areas involved,
Mhm.
what does a condition like Klazomania, as bizarre as it sounds, actually tell us about that deep, intricate connection between our physical brain and our outward behavior, especially when it comes to things we seemingly can't control?
Mm.
It's definitely something to mull over. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.